On a foggy morning in 217 BC, the Roman Republic suffered one of the greatest shocks in its history. A Roman army had been almost completely annihilated in a trap set by Hannibal on the shores of Lake Trasimene. Caught between the fog, the lake, and the mountain passes, the legions found no way to escape, and thousands of them, including their commander Flaminius, were killed. This disaster reminded Rome, in the harshest possible way, that Hannibal was no ordinary commander. After Trasimene, panic spread through the city. Many believed Hannibal would reach the gates of Rome the very next day. The Senate granted extraordinary powers and appointed Fabius Maximus as dictator. Fabius adopted a strategy of attrition, avoiding open battle with Hannibal, blocking his destruction, shadowing his movements, but never engaging in a pitched fight. Rome's elites reluctantly accepted this approach, but the patience of the people was running out. The sight of legions withdrawing while Hannibal roamed freely across Italy was a bitter blow to Roman pride. Months passed. Hannibal, restrained by Fabius's tactics, could not win a decisive victory, but Rome also failed to stop him. Meanwhile, Hannibal continued burning grain stores, raiding provinces, and tightening economic pressure on the Republic. Fabius's cautious style was now increasingly seen as cowardice, and soon the voice of the people rose louder. No more retreating. It's time to fight. By 216 BC, the Roman Senate resolved to crush Hannibal in a single, decisive battle. There was no room for error. Everyone understood that the coming decision would lead either to Rome's destruction or to a monumental revenge. The Senate launched an unprecedented mobilization. Rome and her allied cities conscripted men young and old. Legions were expanded beyond their traditional structure. Tens of thousands of infantry and cavalry were called to arms, and thus emerged the largest Roman army ever assembled up to that time. More than 80,000 heavy infantry, 6,000 cavalry, and auxiliary forces. This massive army was not only meant to defeat Hannibal, it was meant to intimidate him psychologically. Rome believed it could crush the Carthaginian threat in a single, overwhelming blow. Command of the army was given to two consuls, Aemilius Paulus, cautious, experienced, and disciplined; Gaius Terentius Varro, bold, aggressive, and backed by popular support. Their alternating command structure was risky, but the Senate maintained it to avoid any appearance of hesitation before Hannibal. As the Roman army marched south, the mood in the city shifted completely. The grief of Trasimene was still remembered, but now Romans believed the time for vengeance had finally come. And Hannibal, as he moved through the fertile plains of Italy toward the region of Cannae in Apulia, he chose a battlefield perfectly suited for confronting a massive force, an open, wide plain ideal for cavalry maneuvers. Exactly the kind of terrain he wanted. Rome was marching onto the stage of history, convinced that this would be the day it finally crushed Hannibal. But no one yet knew that this enormous army was heading into one of the greatest catastrophes ever seen in military history. When the Romans reached the area near Cannae, Hannibal had already chosen the perfect ground. A wide, open plain, ideal for maneuver. Risky for Rome perhaps, but the consuls trusted their superior numbers. Varro was eager for battle, Paulus far more cautious. But there was no turning back. The Roman army made camp, and it became clear that tomorrow would be a day of war. When Hannibal saw this colossal army approaching, he did not retreat. On the contrary, he was ready with the plan that would turn the plains of Cannae into the greatest catastrophe in Roman history. At dawn, both armies emerged from their camps and began forming their battle lines on the plain of Cannae. The Roman army created an unusually compressed and extremely deep infantry mass at the center. The velites were placed briefly in the front line, but the real weight stood behind them in the ranks of the hastati, principes, and triarii. This central formation was arranged on a narrow frontage, but with great depth, designed to generate a powerful forward push meant to break the Carthaginian center. On the right wing stood the Roman citizen cavalry under Paulus, and on the left, the Latin cavalry under Varro. Because Rome concentrated nearly all its manpower in the center, it left almost no reserves in the rear, and both wings remained relatively weak. The Carthaginian army, in contrast, deployed onto the battlefield with a far more flexible structure. Hannibal placed his Iberian and Gallic infantry in the center, forming a forward-curving line. This formation was designed to yield in a controlled manner under Roman pressure. Just behind this line and on both flanks stood the African heavy infantry, positioned slightly further back so that if the Roman center pushed too far inward, they could pivot and strike from both sides. On the Carthaginian left, Hasdrubal's heavy cavalry took position, significantly stronger in both numbers and striking power than the Roman cavalry opposite them. On the right wing, the Numidian light cavalry prepared to use their speed and maneuverability to harass the Roman left cavalry and prevent them from supporting the infantry in the center. When both sides completed their deployment, Rome stood with a center that was overwhelmingly dense and designed for direct assault, while Carthage stood with a center arranged to bend and absorb pressure, supported by flanks prepared for an enveloping maneuver. Rome held the raw mass. Carthage held the tactical flexibility, a difference that would soon determine the fate of the battle. The battle began with an exchange of missiles between the light troops. The Roman velites moved forward and hurled their short javelins toward the Carthaginian line, testing Hannibal's center and attempting to disrupt its formation before the main engagement. On the opposite side, Carthaginian slingers and archers responded immediately. The Balearic slingers in particular launched stones with tremendous speed, striking the Roman front ranks with considerable force. Because the wind was blowing toward the Romans, dust, sand, and fragments of stone were carried straight into their faces, making it difficult for the velites to see clearly and aim their throws. Although this skirmish lasted only a few minutes, it set the initial rhythm of the battle. As the velites began to exhaust their javelins, they gradually pulled back rather than press further, following standard Roman practice. The Carthaginian light troops, having completed their own task, also withdrew so they would not be caught by the advancing Roman heavy infantry. With both sets of skirmishers moving aside, a wide space opened between the two armies. The field was now cleared for the main engagement. The heavy infantry on both sides, iron shields and dense formations, advanced toward one another, ready to begin the decisive clash that would determine the fate of the battle. The dense and deeply formed Roman infantry blocks began advancing with heavy pressure. Their plan was to break the Carthaginian center by sheer force. Upon contact, the Iberian and Gallic warriors absorbed the initial impact and gradually pulled back. This withdrawal was not a disorderly collapse, but a controlled movement designed to bend the line inward. As the Romans pushed forward, the Carthaginian center took on an increasingly concave shape. At first glance, this looked like a Roman advantage as the enemy line appeared to be giving way. But the farther the Roman infantry pushed, the more exposed their flanks became, and the connection between their center and wings began to weaken. Rome seemed to be advancing, yet in reality, They were being drawn into exactly the position Hannibal intended. At this point, the first major turning moment of the battle occurred. On the Carthaginian left, Hasdrubal organized his heavy cavalry and launched a full-force charge against the Roman right cavalry. The Romans on that flank were clearly inferior, both in numbers and striking power. With the impact of the Carthaginian charge, the Roman line was shaken immediately and quickly lost cohesion. Part of the Roman cavalry tried to maneuver backward, but the riverbank behind them restricted their movement and caused them to become compressed. The rest broke formation and began fleeing in different directions. With the collapse of the Roman right cavalry, the entire flank was left exposed. There were no remaining forces on that side capable of resisting Carthage. Hasdrubal did not hesitate. He reassembled his cavalry, restored enough order within the ranks, and without losing momentum, began a wide turning maneuver toward the rear of the Roman army. This movement formed the first half of the encirclement that would later decide the fate of the Battle of Cannae. On the Roman left flank, the Numidian light cavalry kept the Latin cavalry constantly engaged. Using their superior mobility, the Numidians avoided direct, sustained combat. Instead, they approached in small groups, launched brief attacks, and immediately pulled back. This hit-and-run pattern prevented the Roman left cavalry from forming a stable battle line and forced them to react continuously. The Latin cavalry, being heavier and less agile, struggled to counter these rapid movements effectively. The Numidians' objective was not to destroy the Roman left outright. Their primary mission was to occupy them throughout the battle, restrict their movements, and prevent them from reinforcing the Roman infantry in the center. By keeping the left wing tied down, they helped ensure that Hannibal's plan for the infantry engagement could unfold without interference. As Hasdrubal's heavy cavalry completed its wide turning maneuver and approached the Roman rear, the Numidians increased their pressure. The Roman left cavalry now faced two threats at once: the constant harassment from the Numidians in front and the impending arrival of heavy cavalry behind them. This dual pressure shattered what remained of their cohesion. Units began to break apart. Communication between groups collapsed, and eventually, the entire left flank disintegrated. With the collapse of both Roman cavalry wings, the Roman infantry at the center was left completely exposed. Meanwhile, the Roman center continued to advance with heavy pressure. The densely packed legionary blocks were steadily pushing the Iberian and Gallic troops backward, driving deeper into the Carthaginian line with each step. Although this controlled withdrawal looked like a collapse from the Roman perspective, their forward momentum was actually beginning to disrupt their own formation. The sheer depth of the Roman center meant that every step forward stretched the line further and loosened its connection to the flanks, gradually weakening the overall cohesion. As the Romans pressed on, their central formation extended too far ahead, creating a gap between the center and both wings. Under normal circumstances, Roman commanders would halt such an overextension and pull the line back into a unified shape. But the intensity of the engagement and the mass of troops pushing from behind made any reorganization impossible. What appeared to be Roman strength now became their greatest vulnerability: an elongated, exposed, and increasingly immobile center. This was the moment Hannibal had been waiting for. Once he saw that the Roman line had driven in deep enough, that the wings had opened, and that the central mass could no longer maneuver, he gave the order for the African heavy infantry on both flanks to advance forward and inward. This movement would strike the exposed Roman sides, halt their advance, and initiate the first stage of the encirclement. The African heavy infantry advanced on Hannibal's signal and struck the exposed right and left sides of the Roman center simultaneously. These troops, disciplined and well-armored, pressed inward with a stable formation. The Romans, packed tightly and arranged in deep ranks, struggled to pivot sideways and establish a new defensive line. With the frontal engagement still ongoing, they were unable to respond effectively to the pressure coming from both flanks. As a result, the Roman center began to be compressed not only from the front, but also from both sides. At this stage, the Roman army was effectively under attack from three directions: the Iberians and Gauls to the front, and the African heavy infantry closing in from the right and the left. Because Rome had concentrated so much of its manpower in the center, the flanks lacked both sufficient numbers and the proper angles to defend themselves. This structural weakness set the foundation for the encirclement Hannibal intended to complete. After routing the Roman right cavalry, Hasdrubal quickly reorganized his forces and moved in a wide arc toward the rear of the Roman army. As he advanced, he linked up with the Numidian cavalry, bringing both mounted forces together under unified control. Because the Roman infantry had pushed so far forward, their rear was left almost completely unprotected. Hasdrubal took advantage of this opening and reached the Romans from behind. At this point, the Roman army was entirely encircled. They were still engaged with the Iberians and Gauls in front. On both sides, the African heavy infantry pressed inward, tightening the formation. And now, from behind, Hasdrubal's heavy cavalry and the Numidian horsemen had closed the last remaining gap. With no avenue of retreat left, the Roman line was compressed into a shrinking pocket. This moment marked the completion of one of the most famous double envelopment maneuvers in military history. The Romans were under simultaneous pressure from the front, the flanks, and the rear, completely surrounded and unable to break free. After the Roman army was completely encircled, an inhuman compression began at the center of the battlefield. The legionaries no longer had any possibility of retreat or advance. The soldiers fighting at the front could not step back because of the mass pressing from behind, while those in the rear were unable to move forward, as if colliding with a solid wall of bodies. As the space narrowed, shields locked against one another, and the room needed to swing a sword disappeared entirely. Many soldiers were no longer fighting the enemy, but struggling simply to remain standing under the crushing pressure of bodies around them. Some became unable to move at all without even being wounded. There was no space left to flee, to turn, or to reform any kind of order. As the African heavy infantry advanced inward, step by step from both sides, and the Carthaginian cavalry sealed the rear, the Roman line did not merely break, it collapsed completely. The battle ceased to be a clash between two armies and turned into a systematic slaughter, lasting for hours within a confined space. Carthaginian troops compressed the surrounded Roman mass from the outside inward, destroying every group that became separated exactly where it stood. The longer the Romans resisted, the tighter the space became, until any possibility of escape vanished entirely. This was not a brief engagement, but a relentless and exhausting annihilation that continued as the sun rose higher and pushed toward midday. Within this chaos, Consul Aemilius Paulus refused to withdraw. Wounded, he continued to fight inside the encirclement and was killed along with his army. The other consul, Varro, managed to escape only when the formation had completely collapsed, withdrawing with a small group of cavalry and infantry. By the end of the day, the Roman army had been almost erased from the map. Between 50,000 and 70,000 soldiers were dead, and thousands more had been taken prisoner. Carthaginian losses were far lower by comparison and were largely limited to the Iberian and Gallic units that had borne the brunt of the fighting in the early hours of the battle. In the aftermath of Cannae, the balance of power in Italy was fundamentally transformed. Rome was shaken not only militarily, but politically and psychologically as well. Many allied cities defected to the Carthaginian side, Roman authority collapsed across southern Italy, and Hannibal was able to move freely across the peninsula for years. Having lost the greater part of its army, the Republic was forced to raise new legions. When young men were no longer sufficient, even slaves were pressed into service. Yet Rome did not surrender. The Senate refused to negotiate peace with Hannibal, and Cannae became the beginning of a long and exhausting phase of the war, one in which Rome was defeated but not broken.